get into this week's episode, we just want to thank our official sponsors, 1985 Games, for making this week's episode possible.
They have just launched their Kickstarter for their new Dungeon Craft Terrain book.
The Kickstarter's been live since July 9th and goes on to August 22nd, 2019. And Dungeon Craft is an awesome product for dungeon masters that are looking for portable and or affordable scenery and augmentations for their battle map.
One of the really cool things about this is if you look inside, there's all of these cutout terrain pieces that are actually reversible. So on the opposite side, you get a different version of the thing that you had on the first side. It's really cool, really, really useful, and there's pretty much stuff in here for any type of encounter.
Yes. If you happen to miss out on the Kickstarter, follow the links in the description below to 1985's Games store, where you should be able to pick up a copy in the future.
And now, on to the episode. Your party enters a dark, mysterious cave. You've been traveling through the Underdark for weeks, and this cave seems almost unnatural. Phosphorescent lights loom in the distance. Everything is slimy and damp, and you can't make out what's ahead of you, but you hear suckling and slurping noises.
Slowly coming out of the fog and darkness come a pack of stumbling dark elves. Their eyes are glassed over, and their foreheads and faces drip with sweat as they bear their weapons and a wicked grin on their faces, as if their will is not quite their own. The group parts, and from that space comes floating a hooded figure. As it pulls back its hood, it bears a bulbous, slime-covered and rubbery head that ends in 4 long tentacles which spread, revealing a beaked mouth. As its long, spindly hand reaches towards you, you can feel a psychic force pulling at the edge of your consciousness. Roll for initiative. Greetings! My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we discuss everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for dungeon masters and guides for players.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
In this week's Monster Tactics episode, we are going to be looking at the enigmatic and inscrutable Mind Flayers, the psionic masterminds from beyond the far realm.
We're going to be analyzing their weapons, abilities, and strategies so that you can run a challenging encounter with a Mind Flayer at your table. But the story doesn't stop when swords are drawn, so we're also going to dive a little bit into the lore so that you can roleplay the Mind Flayers and bring a great experience to your players.
There's a lot to discuss, so hold on to your brain and let's get rolling. So Kelly, what makes Mind Flayers such an amazing adversary?
Mind Flayers are highly intelligent. They've been traveling the cosmos for years, enslaving entire races. There's a lot of horror to be done with a Mind Flayer. They're a very scary creature, and encountering one is supposed to be very life-threatening and very intense.
The Mind Flayer is the classic and iconic Lovecraftian supervillain. There are so many opportunities to draw on the tropes of psionic horror, even a little bit of science fiction, in crafting your storylines with Mind Flayers, and especially drawing on some great inspiration from Stranger Things. Nowadays, beyond just the origins in the Lovecraftian mythos, Mind Flayers make for great villains and the awesome seeds for an entire campaign. But more so than this, they are so terrifying to the player characters when they have to face them in combat.
A lot of people don't realize how insane their abilities and the fact that they can outright kill party members. It's really scary to behold a Mind Flayer, and their psionic abilities and the presence that they have at the table should strike fear in any player's heart.
The Mind Flayer presents a truly alien threat to your players. One that really gets to the core of their being, because they're going to eat your brains, steal your memories, and assume your identity, enslave you, turn you into their puppets. And that really makes them a terrifying villain, one whose motivations are almost impossible for mere mortals to comprehend, thanks to their truly alien physiology and psychology. Mind Flayers also bring a huge canon of established lore from the D&D multiverse that you can use as inspiration for designing encounters, adventures, and even entire campaigns. You can pull on the classic storyline of the Mind Flayers as running a great fallen empire and trying to recapture that glory, or you can even use a Mind Flayer as a solitary villain and mastermind. You can connect them to a colony with the Elder Brain and a complete conspiracy controlling the kingdoms of the mortal worlds above the Underdark, or really go into their extraplanar origins and explore the Far Realm as well.
As far as the lore goes, Mind Flayers can be found usually in the Underdark. Because of their fallen kingdoms, they've resided there for years, plotting their revenge against the surface. However, Mind Flayers make great adversaries if you're doing a Cosmos adventure where you're including the Githyanki or the Githzari who were enslaved by the Mind Flayers. Or even if you're just in a city campaign, they could be hiding beneath that city, slowly creeping up to the surface and taking over the brains of the mortals who reside above. There are so many ways to include a Mind Flayer in your campaign, and it always makes for an excellent plot twist, and the players are always going to be terrified when they figure out what's coming.
Eventually, however, the players are going to uncover the schemes of the Mind Flayers, and there will come a time when your player characters are going to face one in battle. So how do we use them in combat, Kelly?
Well, the first thing about Mind Flayers is that they are extremely intelligent psionic beings, meaning that they should be able to outsmart most adventuring parties. They've been around for centuries. They have a hive mind mentality. They are going to try to outsmart you. Not only that, but they're also wise about when to fight and when to not fight. Because of their high intelligence, I imagine that Mind Flayers know when the odds are against them and will get out of an encounter as quickly as possible if they think there's a chance that they're going to lose. They have a lot of tricks that they can pull, and usually a lot of minions at their disposal that they use to beef themselves up to turn the odds in their favor, and they know how to do it.
A Mind Flayer that is caught in battle is in either a winning position or a desperate situation. Any other time in between, the Mind Flayer is probably going to engineer the situations that they are going to flee or get out of there or not be present at all. So I do like to factor that into the encounter design when I'm creating situations with Mind Flayers, that the player characters either need to feel that this is a desperate situation and they need to run, or the Mind Flayer is in a desperate situation and they're the ones that need to run.
A party who's going up against Mind Flayers should be afraid. If you sense that your party isn't afraid of the Mind Flayer because they think that they can sweep the floor with it, then that Mind Flayer probably knows that as well and is going to leave and find a better, more advantageous point to get the drop on the party and use its abilities and its minions to get that upper hand and destroy that party and eat their brains.
But when the chips are down and the Mind Flayer does have to engage in battle, what are its major strengths and weaknesses?
The Mind Flayer has a number of key psychic abilities that actually work really, really well together, and all revolve around devouring brains, which is in itself terrifying. They have lots of ways to stun party members, grapple party members, and then devour their brains with their tentacles and beak.
They also have fantastic magic resistance and a couple innate spellcasting traits through their psionics. But I think the greatest strength of the Mind Flayer, and probably their most terrifying ability, is Mind Blast, which is a massive cone of psychic damage that stuns everyone caught within it. And with a DC 15 intelligence saving throw, many player characters are going to struggle to make their saves against this ability and fall prey to the Mind Flayer's extract brain ability.
Those strong players out there who are playing the big meat shield who's a little bit stupid, better be careful, because a low intelligence means that you might fall prey to a Mind Flayer's Mind Blast, which basically just means free lunch for the Mind Flayer.
On the flip side, Mind Flayers are feeble. For a challenge rating 7 creature, they have terrible hit points, a pathetic armor class of 15, and absolutely terrible strength, dexterity, and constitution saving throws. Even with their magic resistance, a Mind Flayer is going to really be worried about getting hit with a fireball or any spells that target their constitution saving throws. They're going to slough off anything that targets their intelligence, wisdom, or charisma saving throws like nothing. but they're highly susceptible to the amount of damage that can be done by martial classes, and especially damage dealing magic foes. And in fact, the absolute bane of a Mind Flayer is an archer.
So blast them and shoot them.
Blast them and shoot them. And with only 71 hit points, I think that many 7th level characters and higher have no problem doing 71 points of damage in a turn, which means it's very easy for a Mind Flayer to get one shot. The Mind Flayer's tentacle attack does cause an automatic grapple, and then has a chance to stun the target as well, which is a pretty nasty melee attack that the Mind Flayer can make in a desperate situation. I really think that most of the time the Mind Flayer is going to want to be levitating above the ground, using its innate ability to do so, and waiting for its Mind Blast to recharge if it is in a combat situation. On the other hand, this is also a really common misconception with the Mind Flayer, because the extract brain ability of a Mind Flayer does require the Mind Flayer to grapple the target before they can use that ability. I have seen sometimes people run a Mind Flayer where they Mind Blast somebody, and then the next turn the Mind Flayer runs up and immediately extracts the brain. That's actually not what the rules let you do. They do have to go up first, grapple the creature, then on the next turn use extract brain. So the player characters always get at least one turn to try to get their ally out of that grapple before their brain gets devoured.
But if you want to talk about a desperate situation, when one of your players is stunned and the Mind Flayer goes up and grapples it, and the party realizes they have one turn to get their friend out of there before their brain gets extracted, that's an intense situation that's going to bring a lot of drama and fear to the party.
So despite the amount of drama and fear that that situation causes, and I agree, it is a dramatic situation, I think it's absolutely a tactical misstep for a Mind Flayer to try to eat in the middle of battle. I really think the extractive brain ability, despite how dramatic and iconic it is for a Mind Flayer, it doesn't reflect the intelligence and strategic prowess of a Mind Flayer to try to do that in the middle of battle. I think that when they are feeding, they are so vulnerable that really it's a finisher that the Mind Flayer can do in a situation where they're already winning. But if the Mind Flayer is using it to try to even the odds or even the scales, I really am not sure if it's a good idea. I don't think it's the go-to move.
What if your Mind Flayer skip breakfast?
Find the person that presents the biggest threat to the Mind Flayer, and your Mind Flayer is smart enough, it should know all your player character's abilities. It knows who is the biggest threat to it, and that is going to be the target for Dominate Monster. And for me, most of the time, that's going to be the Gloomstalker Ranger. But I think that, because otherwise, if you have a party of melee damage dealers, it's just going to levitate and not worry about them at all. The Mind Flayer also does have Detect Thoughts as an innate spellcasting ability. And the thing to remember with innate spellcasting is that means that they don't need to use any somatic, material, or verbal components to cast those spells. So a Mind Flayer can be constantly detecting the party's thoughts if that would give it a tactical advantage. And its telepathy means that it's going to commanding its allies telepathically in the middle of battle, allowing the whole group of minions to behave like a hive mind too.
I will say that when we talk about tactics for a Mind Flayer, that little intro that we did was actually more of a cinematic intro. I don't think the Mind Flayer would walk out from the group first thing into a battle. What would end up happening is that the party would struggle through all of these minions that are under mind control. They would then deal with the Intellect Devourers at the same time as the minions, and once they're worn down and there's still minions left, maybe then the Mind Flayer presents itself. But the Mind Flayer isn't even going to show up until it thinks that the party is weak enough to be threatened by it.
I think that that's a really key encounter building tool that you can use with villains like Mind Flayers who are vulnerable to an Alpha Strike, is have them appear in the second wave of a battle. And this is a way where you can actually make the Mind Flayer and the first battle a medium encounter, and run the minion battle for 2 or 3 rounds, let the party chew through a couple of the minions, get worn down, and then have that Mind Flayer and a few more minions appear in the most advantageous way for them you can possibly imagine. Because that's part of the Mind Flayer's playbook, and I do think as a dungeon master, I kind of let the Mind Flayers get meta. Like, I metagame my Mind Flayers because I think that that's the best way to capture their otherworldly intellect and their ability to plan.
I always think that there's this slight omnipotence, at least in their attitude. They might not be omnipotent, but their attitude is this omnipotence and hive mind mentality.
Yes.
That when the Mind Flayer does present itself, the way it communicates to the party, the way it talks to them, I think back to probably one of my favorite moments in video game history, which is in the first Mass Effect, when you first encounter the Reapers.
Yes.
And they show up and basically say, "You are nothing. What hope do you have? We have wiped out civilizations for eternity. What are you?" And that, I remember hearing that and I remember finishing Mass Effect 1 and going, what do we do? We're humans.
Now that we've covered some of the Mind Flayer's combat strategies, how it's going to behave offensively, what about on the defense? What is a Mind Flayer's escape plan? Because it should have one. Every Mind Flayer needs to have one.
A Mind Flayer will not go into battle unless it has an escape plan. The other really important thing about the tactics of a Mind Flayer is that if you read up on them, a lone Mind Flayer is usually somebody who's gone against the Elder Brain. Mm-hmm. So generally, if you're fighting a Mind Flayer, there might be other Mind Flayers nearby.
That's going to make the situation really difficult for the player characters, though. And so 2 Mind Flayers at once is a really deadly encounter and a very high-level fight, especially if there's minions on top of that. So we do want to make sure that we are still creating reasonable situations for the players. But where there's one, there's probably more, because they do have that colony mentality.
Which is also part of the escape plan. Is if they know that there's more Mind Flayers nearby, they will retreat to that area.
Yes.
Which then, if the party runs into multiple Mind Flayers, it suddenly becomes a, oh man, we need to get out of here situation. And that can change the tides of the battle for the Mind Flayer. So if they are losing their fight, retreating back to the colony could be one of their key moves.
But they also have a real big trump card in that Mind Flayers can cast Plane Shift on themselves innately. So again, because this is an innate spellcasting ability, a Mind Flayer can Plane Shift even if it's been bound and grappled. And I think that there is no better option than having a Mind Flayer in a desperate situation, Plane Shift back to the far realm, and then come back tomorrow to the material plane.
That basically, yeah, they're smart enough that if they are grappled, if they are going to lose, if they are even below 50% in a battle, they might just be like, this isn't for me. I'm going to Plane Shift out of here.
I think that a Mind Flayer that even takes a single solid hit is at the point where it's like, oh, I might need to get out of here now.
With the Mind Flayer being such an intelligent character, I think this is one of those points where a lot of minions and monsters I run relatively stupid.
Yes.
But the Mind Flayer I'm willing to run with as much knowledge as the DM, have.
I agree. It comes back to that point I made about the metagaming, is that you want to avoid metagaming except when it can do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And I think that using metagame knowledge as a Mind Flayer actually helps capture their intelligence in a really big way. The Mind Flayer should know what the player character's abilities are. The Mind Flayer does understand what their tactics are. And it probably does have the ability to get that information somehow anyways, but it's kind of okay if you think that the Mind Flayer is one step ahead of the game of the players, because the players should feel like the Mind Flayer is 2 or 3 or 4 steps ahead of them.
When the Mind Flayer looks at one of the party members, it's going to be able to determine what armor it's wearing, what weapon it's going to use, what it's skilled with, what spells it has. It's going to know what is threatening to it, and using that knowledge is just a key part of the Mind Flayer's ability to get out of combat or destroy their opponents.
So one of the big things that we've been talking about this whole time are the Mind Flayer needs to have minions. So what minions are you going to pick, and how's the Mind Flayer going to use those minions in battle?
Well, I think what's really cool here is that you want to look at the environment that the Mind Flayer inhabits.
Yes.
In a lot of cases, in the readings of the Mind Flayer, they are in the Underdark. Their troglodytes, their Grimlocks, and their Quaggoths kind of become their minions. No matter what environment you put them in, you want to look for whatever the most lowly monster is in that area, or even more threatening as you get into deeper games. Some of the bigger monsters that they could mind control or take over.
So Volo's Guide to Monsters actually describes the process by which a Mind Flayer creates a thrall. So they kidnap people and bring them back to the colony where they have a ritual process where they can turn someone into a thrall. So you can use any monster in the monster manual you want, can conceivably be one of the Mind Flayer's thralls. And the rule of thumb is basically you ignore its intelligence score and roll 2d6, and that's what its intelligence has become as a thrall. And I think, yes, the Mind Flayers are going to rely on whatever the local flora and fauna is. But I think that they're also going to create minions as well, and the most important one they're going to create is the Intellect Devourer. And I have a truly nasty strategy. The Mind Flayer hides Intellect Devourers in the bodies of its other thralls. So when those thralls are in battle, the players cut the thrall down and the Intellect Devourer jumps out of the head of the minion that they just cut down and attacks them. Because Intellect Devourers have a giant target painted on them. So by hiding the Intellect Devourer in the Mind Flayer's minions, you get this ticking time bomb and a truly terrifying threat.
And what a great explanation and like cinematic moment to bring to the table when they chop down that final thrall, and then all of a sudden all of the thralls' heads start to explode as these walking brains come out and start leaping at the party. That's terrifying.
Indeed. And I think for minions as well, I think that you want to have the bruisers. So you want your troglodytes, your grimlocks. Ogres are an awesome choice in this regard for that big muscle that's just going to interpose themselves between the Mind Flayer and the player characters. But at the same time, I think it's really important to have those Intellect Devourers. I think personally, Mind Flayers are going to love going after Dark Elves because the Drow poison is an amazing tool that the Mind Flayers can co-opt to capture new thralls. And Dark Elves in general have awesome other abilities like Fairy Fire and Levitate and Darkness that can be used to protect the Mind Flayer as well. Another minion that I totally love for Mind Flayers that feels like it should be a Mind Flayer creation is the Grell. Because the Grell looks like a floating brain with tentacles coming out of it. And it can float around with its blind sight, and its tentacles cause paralysis. So what better minion for a Mind Flayer than a floating brain that paralyzes targets and carries them away?
All right, so your adventuring party walks into this gloomy cave. They start seeing these like troglodytes or quaggoths running at them. The melee combatants are dealing with that. The archers lining up their shot. And then the Grell drops from the shadows in the ceiling, paralyzes it, and just starts carrying it away.
Exactly. That's why the Grell is the perfect companion to a Mind Flayer, because it gives them that assassin that's going to take out the really big threat to the Mind Flayer themselves. And I just love the imagery of like, here's your floating brain with tentacles, here's your brain with legs, and here's your guy that devours brains. It totally fits the theme, and I actually don't know why the Monster Manual doesn't make the Grell a minion of Mind Flayers.
Yeah, seems like the perfect pet.
We talked about lots of different ways to build encounters with the Mind Flayers themselves, just using the stock Mind Flayer in the Monster Manual. Volo's Guide to Monsters and the Monster Manual also present several variants of the Mind Flayer, but we could also homebrew them ourselves with our own class features and other abilities. Do you have any ideas for what you would do to change a Mind Flayer to make them a bigger threat if they were maybe the main villain or the leader within the colony themselves?
The first one I'm going to mention is obvious because a lot of the augmented versions in the books already recommend this, and that's giving them spellcasting.
Yeah, and I think that having spellcasting or psionics, because you do get the two variants that are in the Monster Manual and the Volo's Guide to Monsters, give the Mind Flayers other things to do that aren't Mind Blast, that keep them at range. And I do think the Mind Flayer gains a lot by having things like Shield and Counterspell in their arsenal, as well as perhaps the ability to cast Scrying and Wall of Force. If you go back to our videos on 5 spells for villains, I think the Mind Flayers are a perfect candidate for some of these spells and tactics as well. And I think Scrying is a really big part of their playbook that someone in the Mind Flayer colony has got to have that ability.
I even just think giving them some quick little blasty cantrips or things like that just help make them a bigger threat on the battlefield.
Yeah, one of the Mind Flayers in Volo's Guide to Monsters, the psionic one, has Vicious Mockery as one of their spells. A perfect little spell to put in there. Hold Person, Hold Monster, both excellent ones. Or you might even want to go with illusions and enchantment spells like Hypnotic Pattern or Synaptic Static is kind of a perfect spell for a Mind Flayer.
That's such a nice little psionic bomb to drop on the party, and it's so fitting. If you can find really any spells that deal with messing with the party's mind, you're on the right track to role-playing an awesome Mind Flayer and building them nicely.
Phantasmal Force, Suggestion. I would even probably put some teleportation spells and maybe even invisibility and illusions in their toolkit. And that's just going to make a much more credible threat with the Mind Flayer. And it doesn't increase their challenge rating too much. The examples in the Monster Manual and Volos only bump a Mind Flayer, Arcanist, or Psionicist with 5th level spellcasting, so that's 5th level spells, up to challenge rating 8. So there are several high-level variants of the Mind Flayer that we already had in the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters. The Ulatharid, which is the proto-Elder Brain, kind of the bigger, badder Mind Flayer, is the perfect leader for a Mind Flayer colony, and if I wanted to beef them up, I would probably give them the spellcasting treatment as well. You've also got the Alhoon and the Mind Flayer Lich, and of course, the Elder Brain. So I think within that, you've got a lot of options that are already given to us as templates for how to turn a Mind Flayer into a high-level threat. As far as role-playing the Mind Flayer, I think a really interesting thing, beyond just the inscrutability and how, as you said, Kelly, it doesn't care, it's totally alien, is that a Mind Flayer looks at mortals almost like Pavlovian dogs. Like, Mind Flayers think that mortals are just conditioned meat brains that aren't on the same level of intelligence as they are. They think we're ants, or at very best, dogs that can be trained and controlled and turned into useful tools. So a Mind Flayer's like, oh, every mortal behaves this way when presented with gold. Under these circumstances, every of those lesser humans is going to behave this way. And maybe when they don't behave the way a Mind Flayer predicts, that's when a Mind Flayer either panics or gets fascinated.
That is actually a great flaw for a Mind Flayer. I was trying to think of what the flaw of a Mind Flayer was, and I'm like, they're too intelligent, and they would outsmart the party, but maybe they're so intelligent that when somebody does something against what they just assume, because a Mind Flayer is so smart that I bet they think so highly of themselves that they're like, all humans are dumber than me. And then maybe they meet a human that has 20 intelligence, and suddenly, how do you know as much as I know?
That is a really great way to play into a flaw of a Mind Flayer that gives you a role-playing angle that is interesting and compelling.
Let's talk about how we would build an encounter around a Mind Flayer. What would that look like?
So to me, if I was building the encounter with the Mind Flayer, I would go right back to what we discussed earlier, where I would build 2 encounters that came in waves. If I'm going to have a fight with the Mind Flayer, I'm going to have an early encounter that's going to be a pair of ogres, some drow, and then one of the ogres or one of the drow has an intellect devourer inside its brain. And then after 2 or 3 rounds, the Mind Flayer shows up with a few more Grimlocks and a Grell.
That's a terrifying encounter. And it builds nicely, too, up to the Mind Flayer. So I think the reveal of the Mind Flayer in the 2nd or 3rd round of combat makes it so much more terrifying because the party's already dealing with an issue. And then, first of all, you have that intellect devour exploding out of the brain, or exploding out of the head of one of the minions, and you say, oh my god, what's that? And then the Mind Flayer shows up, and then you're just done. So this has been a look at monster tactics for the Mind Flayer in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you have any awesome stories about running or encountering Mind Flayers in your game, tell us about them in the comments below.
If you're enjoying the channel and find our work useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can follow the links in the description below to learn how you can contribute to our work.
And don't forget to check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes on a playlist right up over here.
And we have plenty more tips and tricks for Dungeon Masters in our playlist right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.